Hello everyone, my name is Mateusz Maj. I am working in OLX Group. My job is focused on automotive market and e-commerce data analysis. However, today I'm going to tell you about abilities of neural networks to classify MMI scenarios using images depicting real situations in the future. There is a tendency in sport research to focus on latest performance or prediction of competition's outcomes. So analysis related to sport consists mostly on statistical data, but the computer vision approaches finds usage also in this area. And a good example in this case are sport events classifications. I am going to start with presentation of common thinking in the computer vision and some examples of research related to the topic. And then I will tell about my struggles in understanding of fights, because that allowed me to prepare for experimentation. After that, I will discuss experiment itself and of course its results. Image classification as well as image recognition require the composition of pictures. Analysis consists in this situation on finding some patterns that allow to define meaning on the whole picture. In this case, we can talk a bit about ontologies. The ontology is an abstract, simplified view of the world that is used for some purpose like classification. And this word consists on representational elements that we call concepts. The set of these concepts and relations between them describe the target world. This thinking was used by integration of scene and categorized objects, like in example on the slide. The scene of the lake was described by recognized water, rowing boat, athlete, and trees in the background, and that allowed to classify this picture as a rowing event. The integrative model used in this specific research to classify sport events among 8 disciplines achieved an accuracy at 73%. Actually, we may depend on developed convolutional networks, architectures, and some preceding preparations that should allow to learn and generalize from detailed structures of the pictures. Based on the example that somehow inspired me in preparation of own experiment, where the aim of the research was to classify 26 disciplines of Olympic Games, the model basing on GoogleNet, trained on augmented and balanced dataset, achieved 87% accuracy. However, models still take advantages of finding some describing patterns. In my case, such patterns could be fighters, equipment like gloves, or elements of octagon, but they would only allow to distinguish fight confrontations from other disciplines, where I am working within one type of the event. So I expect to find patterns related to fighters' poses, as I can easily imagine a punch, kicking, or fighting, or ground fight. More complex research related to one discipline, like on the example of golf, develops own architectures, sometimes incorporate usage of short movies, but they are focused on specified techniques. My research tried to find meaning of relatively complex structures from static images described in further slides. The purpose of MMI is to allow fighters to take advantages of different techniques. These techniques are, of course, derived from other combat disciplines like jiu-jitsu, judo, classical boxing, or kickboxing. The aim of MMA was to fulfill Vale-Tudo idea. That means that all techniques are allowed during the fight. As a result of that, we may expect to notice wide variations of actions. However, research shows something quite different. Basing on example of analysis of KSW fights, and there was proved that the majority of actions are represented by distance striking, that's mean punching or kicking, or ground and pound fights. There was noticed very little drawbacks, takedowns, and hinges that should be normal during the fight. Moreover, one of the research shows that the versatility of used techniques deviate from 3 to 15%, depending, of course, on the fighter and round. And that allows us to conclude that although fighters are comprehensively prepared to the fights, they perform usually with a limited number of used techniques. That may be caused by choice of the tactics. The tactics should comprise reduction of risk of being injured or increase a chance of domination of the opponent. Fighters usually take advantages of well-trained actions that may be successful during the fight. They also tend to perform a ground fight as it allows them to win by submission. We have also think a bit about available pictures. As MMI is getting popular also in Poland, fight styles can be easily acquired from the internet. However, federations use pictures to promote own events and own fighters, so they choose the best presented actions. The choice of published images make it difficult to create balanced dataset. Having knowledge from research, I decided to analyze 6 types of styles. 3 of them, the most important, were presented on this slide. Of course, they can contain minor variations, but probably in a chaotic fight, they wouldn't be easily noticed. The most important, of course, are the kicking, punching, and ground fight. 3 other representing wrestling and some of grappling actions, the neutral situation and fighter alone, fulfill the whole view of situation in the cage. I expect that the group depicting wrestling activities is the most ambiguous, as this group is the less defined and generally includes situations of close distance struggles that usually provide to ground fight. I want to stress here that I am taking advantage of images depicting real situation, so the data set may include misleading scenes. And that is caused by simultaneous fighters' activities, oftenly noticed during counterattacks. It is quite common that fighters use punches to stop kicking of the opponent, or in the other hand, for example, there is used front kick to stop opponent's punching. Specific images required deeper knowledge, sometimes consultations, and taking the decision at the moment of annotation. I have to also add that research mentioned before were provided separately by two coaches. And the agreement of their assessment, measured by Cohen's kappa index, varied between 76 to 85%, depending on the research. So there is proved some of inconsistency in agreement even between professionals. So I may expect that some of the sums can be troublesome for classification for the model. I have also to add that some of pictures were taken from different point of view. And there's quite often that the ground fights may be observed from the top of the octagon. Most of them represent the view of the spectator, especially when I used also on photographs taken during fight exclusive night event. Dataset containing images collected from the internet from events like KSW, Fight Exclusive Night, also UFC or Bellator, describing different situations in the cage, were divided into three sets. The hugest one is, of course, training set that was augmented to more than 10,000 pictures. To validation set that was used during training, and test set used at the end of the experimentation. The collection of the pictures was trained in similar conditions using different well-known architectures. Recent years brought development of variety of types of convolutional neural networks architectures, and of course there was also improved accuracy. The well-known architectures were evaluated in the ImageNet large-scale visual recognition challenge, where the aim is to classify among 1,000 categories, but ImageNet dataset contains more than 22,000 categories. The most popular architectures like VGG16 and VGG19 developed in 2014 achieved accuracy at 74%. And the next year, also the well-known architectures also used in my experiment achieved a much visibly higher accuracy. And the best proposition are closer to 90% of accuracy, but as you can see, many of them deviate between 70 and 90%. In case of my data set, three of architectures found to be quite similarly effective in case of accuracy. However, DenseNet architectures have much lower and visibly lower cross-entropy loss. This is the property of DenseNet that requires less parameters and less computation, and that's why it's less prone for overfitting. Overfitting is a quite common problem in training of image data set, and it's a problem facing for the modelers that try to reduce this problem. The best solution based on data on DenseNet 169 allow to quite properly recognize ground fights. This is about 90. and 94% of true situation was found properly, and also is quite effective in case of kicking and punching, but there is some kind of trade-off between these groups. Probably this is caused by counterattacks and other misleading scenarios. The most problematic is, of course, wrestling, what was expected at the beginning. Now I'm going to present some examples. Actually, on this slide, you can see the proper classifications. And they are not the best one, but the one I really liked. In the case of a fighter with recognized with 87%, it was recognized properly, although there was interfering of service. Ground fight, the picture that you were able to notice on the previous slides was recognized properly. The kicking, in this case, this is a knee kick that requires closer distance than typically kicking, and could be misleaded with wrestling, but was properly recognized with a very high certainty. Neutral situation. I had a few of pictures that presented fighter that the winner and the defeated fighter, and in this case also the sun was properly recognized. This punch was the most of the typical ones, so there shouldn't be any problems. And wrestling, this is the specific situation of the perspective and the view from the top of the octagon, and although the perspective, the picture was properly recognized with almost 100% certainty. There were, of course, some misclassification that I will try to justify. In case of fighter, probably his position on the octagon, maybe somehow the background allowed to misclassify this picture as a ground fight. The next problem on the next picture, when the situation of ground fight was misclassified as wrestling situation, was caused by the perspective. As I told you before, there was quite often observed ground fight from the top of the octagon, but in this case that make a problem. Kicking, this is quite close knee kick, and the close distance allowed to classify this picture as a wrestling situation. Maybe also because of the cage in the background that was quite common for wrestling situation. The other one, typical counter-attack with misclassified by model. However, we can discuss here that should be noticed here punch or kicking. And two examples of neutral and wrestling situation that was predicted as kicks. However, it's quite difficult to justify the situation, but there was probably the positions of the fighters. Some other unclear situations that are common, of course, in MMA confrontations. This was on the first picture. There was it was labeled as a kick. This is clear low kick. However, model classified the situation as resting. Next kick was predicted properly. However, it could be misleaded by the movements of the hands. The two pictures below are labeled as a punch, but were predicted as a kick. Probably model focused on the fighter who was trying to perform kicking on the first picture, and in the second situation, when the kick was mistakenly used to the opponent, was noticed by the model and somehow was noticed as a kicking situation. Summing up this talk, I wanted to stress three things. I have described the common approaches in visual analysis in sport, that they are quite common and they are getting more effective. And the idea behind that is to finding specific patterns that allow to describe the whole situation. Then I presented some findings about MMI. In this case, I wanted to stress that it is quite important to analyze on the data set and build some expectations of the experiment. As I believed at the beginning that I'm going to analyze a lot of actions. In fact, as having data and having images, I decided to imitate analytical groups that allowed to distinguish my data set. And of course, experimentations that proved that actual architectures and some approaches allow to classify quite properly images, find their meaning. Of course, there are some mistakes that were expected also by me. At the end of this presentation, I want to thank my trainer, who also consulted some of the pictures and taught me about some practical aspects of preparation to the fights. Please do not hesitate to ask the questions, and I hope you liked this presentation.
Thank you. Thank you, Mateusz, for this interesting presentation. It was so great to hear more about the project that you do from a pure passion, because you love, I guess, MMA, and that's why you did it. We have some questions on the chat. Yeah. All right. You mentioned that it is hard to create a balanced data set. How big was the imbalance in your data, and how did you deal with that?
So the truth in this case is that, in fact, I used a balanced data set because I decided not to take all of the pictures related to punching or kicking. And that's why, in case I had a small number, literally small number of clinches and wrestling situations, that was, let's say, a base for the whole data set. That's why I decided to keep the balance in this way. Of course, we can think how to work with imbalance data set, but I, in this case, decided to keep a balanced situation.
Cool. Would it be possible to differentiate two fighters so each of them would be a separate entity and get their own label?
Yes, I was thinking about the solution related to recognition of the fighter at the beginning, and the next, of course, the classification. However, I have found some obstacles, and also the fundamental, let's say, thinking in this case was how model is able to classify the picture and understand the meaning. But also talking about obstacles, I think there was a lot of problems with ground fight when fighters are in a very close fight, and very often the fighter dominated fighter is not visible. That's why maybe the solution could be, in this case, be have striking and separate the models, and separate situation would be ground fight in this case. However, this is my thinking in let's say, in the development of the project.
Mm-hmm. Okay, you mentioned internet as a main origin of, as main source of the data, the images. Did you use web scraping, and how were you able to label the data?
The origin of the data were, let's say, I would say, two sources. One of them were my picture that you have, that you were able to see on this presentation, and also the internet. In case of the internet, this is also the problem that I also mentioned in the presentation, that there is a lot of picture, but let's say not classified. And that's why there was my initiative to label on my own, and in in a very problematic situation, I have consulted that. Of course, there could be some of the pictures questions by many other people, and this is the common problem in the MMA. What I have also mentioned in the presentation, when for real analysis and generally during the MMA matches, there's the problem of assessment of the situations in the cages.
Okay. Are you planning to further develop the project? Any possibility to make it a multi-label classification? Have you thought of that?
I was thinking about two ways. Actually, yes, I'm thinking about develop to that. This also the way that I have mentioned to, let's say, classify much more striking situation. I think there is nothing to do with ground fight. However, I have to mention that in fact there is much numerous, let's say, types of ground fights, but however not of them are very visible. That's why I'm rather focused on striking in future, and of course if it will be possible, maybe to use some video moves to be much clear in this in some fightings.
Okay, thank you Mateusz, for being here with us today.